Hey everybody, I hope that your week is going well. I was just able to read through the discussion board for José Angel Hernández's book. I've enjoyed so far reading your thoughts on his approach to the history of colonization and repatriation along the border. I just want to say a few things about the discussion, about the book. I do realize that there are a few of us who are still finishing up the replies on that discussion, and that's fine. Please go ahead and add those as you're able to do so. I'll update your scores once you do, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts. Also, I'm looking forward to the blog posts on this book. This book is an interesting one for me because it's kind of close to my own research. So my dissertation focused on the history of the Chihuahua, New Mexico border around the turn of the 20th century. I was focusing less on colonization specifically and more on how things like violence and the development of the capitalist economy along the border um, both shattered and created communities there. And so I look at a lot of different things from the end of the so-called Apache Wars up through the Mexican Revolution. So, of course, I deal quite a bit with Pancho Villa and into the 1930s when the revolution came to a close and efforts at land reform took hold in the area. So early on in my dissertation work, I had contacted José Angel Hernández. Someone in my department had gone to school with him at the University of Chicago, and so they knew that he was working on the same area that I was looking at. I was also particularly interested in the Mormon colonization of northwestern Chihuahua early in my research. And so, again, I reached out to him. And I'll never forget one of the things that what's the right term? He was adamant about the idea that if I'm doing the work that I'm doing, I have to be consulting archives in Mexico. Because I think that maybe that became more apparent to me because I had that experience with him, corresponding with him. But as I read the book again for class, that was something that really stuck out to me. The extent to which he traveled to municipal archives along the borderlands, did work in those archives, met cronistas or local archivists, and not only got to know the documents, but got to know the places, the people, and I think that's hugely important for writing history. Really knowing and understanding the context that we're in. Or that the people we're writing about were in, understanding the geography, understanding the social and racial context, all of those kinds of things. So, sorry, I don't mean to ramble here, but José Angel Hernández has been helpful to me as well in my research, and so again, I enjoyed rereading his work. I do think that it can be a little bit sloggy at times in terms of trying to get through the writing, the way that it's presented. But as some of you pointed out on Twitter and in our discussion, it's very formulaic in terms of being a good academic text where there's going to be the intro, the conclusion. You can look at those so that you can understand exactly what he's getting at and go back to the middle to see how he did that, how he supported his ideas. A couple of his big ideas, of course, are pushing back against this notion that colonization in Mexico was meant to whiten the Mexican population. That is an idea that comes from other Latin American histories, or historiographies, as he points out, particularly in Argentina and South America, other places in South America, where European colonization, or I should say immigration, was encouraged, and there were a lot of concessions made around that in the late 19th century with the explicitly stated idea that bringing Europeans to places like Argentina would whiten the population. The late 19th century was a time, in terms of ideologies, that has been described by many as scientific racism. So new sciences like sciences around heredity, including eugenics, came out, that wanted to apply the scientific method to all aspects of the human experience, including social relationships, including trying to think of things like race, class, and gender not as socially constructed, but as somehow biological in nature. That created all sorts of racist arguments about how and why white people were better than everyone else, essentially. And so, in that context, leaders who are wanting to modernize their nations, who are wanting to bring them on par with Europe, and European nations had worldwide empires at that time. They were doing their best to quote unquote whiten their populations. So again, that's where that idea comes from, and I say all that to point out that it's not something that came from left field out of nowhere. These were ideas that Porfirio Diaz in Mexico also adhered to, but the colonization policies themselves didn't. And that's the huge important thing that Hernandez's work helps us understand as the border was forming and as people were moving back and forth, especially the diaspora, or los de afuera, as he refers to them, and as many of them are referred to in Mexico itself, those from outside. As colonization policies were put in place, the intent was to bring back people from what became the United States after 1848, but who had belonged to Mexico prior to that time. So again, there are a lot of Mexican heritage people in the southwestern United States who the Mexican state targeted with these repatriation programs and colonization programs. Aside from the story of La Ascensión, which I think is super fascinating, I'm glad he was able to go into such detail about that one. I'm hoping we'll talk more about that in our blog posts. Aside from that, there is some evidence from the area of Las Palomas, which is next to La Ascensión. It sits between La Ascensión and the border, that show more support for the argument that he was making. And so I will include an English translation of one of those documents that I used in my dissertation research here. I'd love to hear what you think about it, being able to read one of the sources that Hernandez cites in terms of what he claims that it showed. Of course, he used many, many, many other sources as well. But again, I hope to get some of your thoughts on that. So I'll post this video both in the announcements and in the discussion itself, so that you can respond wherever it makes most sense to you. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think the colonization contract, what kind of authority it's giving from the Mexican government to Luis Euler, who was this German Mexican magnate that got the concession in the I think this one was late 1880s. So again, looking forward to that. The last thing I wanted to mention, something that Joseph brought up in the discussion, is that Hernandez is good at pointing out there are so many blind spots in the historiography. We need to have Mexican records here. But he kind of treats Native people with that broad brush that he is critiquing others of having done to the Mexican populace, I think. So again, think about how well he addressed the place of Native people in his stories. They're always that foil for the practitioners of these colonization schemes, that we need to colonize the northern frontier so that these people can fight against the Indios Bárbaros. He mentions that term that was used by a lot of people in Mexico in the 19th century still, barbaric Indians. So in his analysis, though, does he show us the Native people's humanity, or are they just a foil in his story as well? And what could be done about that? So again, just things to think about, especially if you still need to do a couple reply to this. I always talk too long, so I've let this video go a bit longer than I meant to. Apologize for that. I look forward to talking to you all more and continuing our work together.